All right. Well, welcome. Welcome to Lifting the Curtain on the Sacred Choral Music of Nikolai Golovanov. My name is Sergey Tkachenko. I'm a third-year doctoral student in choral conducting at the University of Cincinnati College-Conservatory of Music. And this evening, you'll hear about Russian composer Nikolai Golovanov, born in 1891 and died in 1953, and his contribution to the genre of sacred a cappella choral music. Specifically, I'll present an overview of his biography and compositional output, followed by a comparative analysis of the stylistic traits that he inherited from his training at the Moscow Synodal School and those that were uniquely his own. This lecture will reveal how Golovanov pushed the developments of the new Russian choral school to their limits, integrating distinct compositional practices that permeate his works. After the lecture portion, a chamber choir of the finest singers from CCM and the surrounding area will perform a survey of Golovanov's works, including his pre-revolutionary compositions from Golovanov's days as a student through the works towards the end of his life. So why Nikolai Golovanov? Well, to start, I was raised in the Russian Orthodox Church. Naturally, I have an interest in singing and conducting music from this storied church tradition, especially because it captures the essence of the Slavic experience. I first encountered Nikolai Golovanov through Tenebrae's 2014 album Russian Treasures, rightly called so, conducted by Nigel Short. There were only 2 pieces by Golovanov on that recording. Not surprisingly, these are the only 2 pieces by Golovanov for mixed choir published by the US-based music publisher Musica Rusica, with an accessible English transliteration of the Church Slavonic text. Golovanov wrote 64 sacred a cappella choral works, 6 for men's chorus and 58 for mixed chorus, several including soloists. So needless to say, Golovanov is an understudied composer who, despite occupying a significant place in Russian sacred choral music at the turn of the 20th century, remains largely unknown today, both in Russia and abroad. This is due to, 1, the Russian Revolution of 1917, which stifled the performance and publication of Russian sacred choral music, forcing Golovanov to abandon this aspect of his career and pivot instead to a life as a Soviet orchestral conductor, the role for which he's best remembered today. 2, his choral works have been historically marginalized until late. He does not fit neatly into the established narrative of the new Russian choral school, and American music historiography has often privileged avant-garde orchestral composers over sacred choral figures. While interest in Golovanov's sacred choral music grew in the last decade of the 20th century, his complete collected sacred works for a cappella choir were only published recently in 2019 by Moscow-based sacred music publisher Zhivonosny Istochnik, which means life-bearing springs. The same year, a comprehensive musicological and theoretical study of Golovanov's sacred choral music was published in a Russian monograph by Andrei Kovalyov and Andrei Poltarukhin. 3, we're still presenting problems here. The issue of access to Golovanov's music is further complicated by the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war. Ongoing geopolitical instability, restrictions on international commerce, and the fragility of cultural exchange have made these sources difficult to obtain outside of Russia, further delaying their integration into Western scholarship and performance practice. So now let's just talk about Golovanov a bit and his biography. He was a symphonic and opera conductor, composer, pianist, accompanist, teacher, publicist, and even a collector of visual art. He received his early musical training at the Moscow Synodal School, a boarding school for boys aged 7 to 18, whose roots extend back to the 16th century. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Synodal School had become the leading institution for the training, composition, and performance of sacred choral music in pre-revolutionary Russia. The Synodal Choir achieved a reputation for exceptional artistic excellence. In addition to its liturgical function, the choir played a pivotal role in establishing sacred choral music as a viable concert tradition, which is important because Golovanov's sacred choral music often fits in a liminal genre space. Is it meant for the church, or is it meant for concert? Golovanov maintained a lifelong reverence for the synodal school. Reflecting on his formative years there, he later wrote, "The synodal school gave me everything. All of the moral principles and life foundations brought me a sacred love of work, iron discipline, and the ability to work a lot and systematically." This training instilled him not only to be musically disciplined, but also instilled in him a deeply rooted spirituality and ethical framework that would shape his artistic identity. After graduating from the synodal school, Golovanov continued his studies at the Moscow Conservatory, where his career as a conductor and composer began to take root. His composition teacher, Sergey Tkachenko, described him as exemplary among his peers, noting his exceptional musicianship, including his ability to play and transpose anything in sight. Tkachenko characterized Golovanov as already an interesting composer upon entering his classes. I think you'll hear that today in his early works. During this period, Golovanov encountered and worked alongside the most prominent musicians of his time. He befriended Alexander Scriabin at the Moscow Conservatory. He conducted Rachmaninoff's Liturgy of St. John of Chrysostom just 2 months after its premiere. And several years after graduating from the Moscow Conservatory, he prepared the choir for a performance of Rachmaninoff's choral symphony, The Bells, under the composer's baton. Alongside his studies and early professional engagements, Golovanov served as teacher and assistant conductor at the synodal school. In 1917, Russian Revolution, October of 1917, Nikolai Danilin, then director of the synodal choir, wrote to Golovanov indicating that he was to become the next director of the ensemble, a highly coveted and respected position. However, the October Revolution of 1917 and its aftermath abruptly ended Golovanov's promised appointment. In the spring of 1918, the synodal school was closed. Ironically, that same year, the prominent Russian music publisher Jurgensen issued 32 of Golovanov's sacred choral works in 4 opuses, marking a high point in the dissemination of his sacred music. Yet, the political climate of post-revolutionary Russia made continued public engagement with sacred choral music increasingly untenable. Following the revolution, he redirected his career almost entirely towards sacred musical life, becoming a prominent Soviet conductor whose reputation was built primarily on operatic and symphonic repertoire. He devoted over a third of his life to the Bolshoi Theater. Opera singers in here know what that opera house is, and held major conducting posts with the All-Union Radio Orchestra, the Moscow Philharmonic Orchestra, and the Stanislavski Opera Theater. Golovanov left behind a substantial legacy of audio recordings and remains a household name in Russia to this day, comparable, I would say, in stature to what we think of Leonard Bernstein here in the United States. In addition to his conducting career, Golovanov served as professor of opera and orchestral conducting at the Moscow Conservatory at 2 different points in his life. He was also an accomplished pianist accompanist, spending decades collaborating on chamber music with his wife, the celebrated soprano Antonina Nezhdanova, who, as an aside, was 18 years his senior. As another aside, Rachmaninoff composed his vocalese for Nezhdanova. Do you know this tune? Da 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 da. He wrote that for Golovanov's wife. When she asked Rachmaninoff why the piece had no text, he reportedly replied, "What need is there of words when you will be able to convey everything better and more expressively by your voice?" So, Golovanov remained a devout Orthodox Christian throughout his life and held firm convictions about the moral and spiritual responsibilities of musicians. He resisted efforts to politicize repertoire at the Bolshoi Theater, instead favoring the music of his contemporaries and friends, particularly Scriabin and Rachmaninoff. This stance drew criticism from the Russian Association of Proletarian Musicians, Soviet, blah, blah, blah. Despite receiving the prestigious Stalin Prize 4 times, Golovanov fell out of political favor, and in 1952, Stalin dismissed him from his post at the Bolshoi Theater, following rumors of dissatisfaction on the part of the Kremlin. He died the following year, reportedly crushed by the humiliation. Although his post-revolutionary sacred choral works remained largely unknown during his lifetime, except among those closest to him, until their first publication in 2014 by the same Life-Bearing Springs publisher I mentioned, Golovanov continued composing in this genre throughout his whole life. In addition to his sacred choral output, Golovanov composed extensively in secular genres, including over 200 romances, which are voice and piano pieces, numerous piano works, including a piano sonata, and a range of orchestral compositions, including a symphony, 2 symphonic poems, orchestral suites, an overture on Russian themes, the opera Princess Yurata, and many folk song arrangements. So go out there and find his music. The New Russian Choral School. Now here's just some context. I'll lay the groundwork, tell you what was around during his time, and then I'll separate him from his colleagues and show you what was uniquely his. In the late 19th century, a new trend was forming in sacred music in Russia, which echoed developments in Russian nationalist groups like the Mighty Handful, Moguchaya Kucha. Those are, if you remember, Q.E., Rimsky-Korsakov, Mussorgsky, Borodin, and Balakirev, if you remember those from your Western history classes. Whereas these composers wrote predominantly secular music, drawing their inspiration from Russian folk melody, the composers of the New Russian Choral School drew from ancient Slavonic chant, also known as znamenny chant, or kryuki, just basically neumes, symbols. Russian-American musicologist and expert on the New Russian Choral School, Vladimir Marasan, who's also the owner and founder of Musika Rusika, the publisher that I mentioned earlier. He wrote that the rediscovery of chant demonstrated that Russian sacred music could likewise draw upon an indigenous melodic tradition, producing new works in a distinctly national style. It was through the setting and incorporation of chant that teachers at the Moscow Synodal School, including Alexander Kostalsky, attempted to preserve the orthodoxy of liturgical singing, which in their opinion was being negatively influenced by Western operatic and symphonic practices. Golovanov and his contemporaries were part of a new direction of composers that incorporated freely composed chant-like melodies into their compositions, freeing themselves from the use of pre-existing chant as source material for polyphonic compositions. Rachmaninov was a leader in this development, inventing melodies that imitated chant. Musicologist Ellen Bakurina describes this style of free composition as a conscious counterfeit of chant. Yuri Keldysh, in his book on Rachmaninoff, points out that there is essentially no stylistic difference, and a listener familiar with the znamenny cycle of chant cannot distinguish themes composed by Rachmaninoff himself from those he borrowed. The complexity and technical demands of Rachmaninoff's compositions made them inaccessible to all but the largest and best choirs in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. Rachmaninoff's entire sacred choral output was premiered by the Moscow Synodal School. Are you drawing a connection here? When Golovanov was either singing in or directing that choir. So the correlation is very clear of influence. Because of his exposure to Rachmaninoff's music, Golovanov's music exhibits a similar reliance on chant-like melodies, choral orchestration, and bold harmonic devices, while pushing boundaries through unprecedented vocal ranges and textural density. The combination of his synodal training, exposure to Western techniques, and close contact with Rachmaninoff's music situates Golovanov as both an inheritor and innovator within the New Russian Choral School. So now let's just talk briefly about the musical characteristics of the New Russian Choral School so that you'll understand better how Golovanov was different. One of the byproducts of using chant or chant-like melodies as source material is the resulting harmony. The chant melodies lend themselves to a harmonic practice which is a hallmark of Russian music. called переменность, or mutability, where the music oscillates between two or more diatonic key areas, often related by a third. Переменность permeates Golovanov's music. It's difficult to analyze his music in a singular tonal center. I'll turn your attention to some examples. If you picked up an example sheet on your way in, there's also QR codes if we ran out of those, if you want to pull them up on your phone. I think they should be on the stands. In measure 2 to 3 of Otche Nash, Golovanov oscillates between F sharp minor and A major, related by the same key signature. See example 1. This tonal ambiguity lends itself to the richness of modal mixture where two tonalities are blended. Alexander Kostalsky, who I mentioned earlier, one of the leading figures in the new Russian choral school and Golovanov's composition teacher, emphasized a chant-based approach to Russian sacred choral music. Among his teaching materials was a table titled Timbres of Various Combinations of Choral Voices, which cataloged a wide range of choral colors available to composers. See example 2. This document, listing choral orchestral techniques, reflects the aesthetic ideals of the new Russian choral school at the turn of the century. Golovanov incorporated new Russian choral school principles into his own sacred works. In the opening measures of Otche Nash, Golovanov uses a chant-like melody, choral orchestration which brings out this melody, and a harmonic palette that reflects its modal characteristics. Example 1 shows a chant-like melody in the soprano and alto parts. This melody is mostly conjunct and syllabic, with a few melismatic turns that resemble chant. Golovanov doubles the tune in the soprano and alto part for emphasis. Numbers 6 and 7 in example 2 show Golovanov's adaptation of Kostalsky's choral orchestration techniques in how he doubled the descant, the soprano, and altos together in a pianissimo dynamic in a four-voice texture. It's right out of the composition textbook of his teacher. Golovanov's unique stylistic traits. Here's where I'll ask the choir to demonstrate a few things. Golovanov is part of the new direction in the new Russian choral school, a collective of young composers who tended towards freely composed compositions characterized by incredible thickness and complexity of texture and lush harmonies. His unique stylistic traits emerge from the synthesis of his influences, training, and professional practice, in which he integrated progressive secular instrumental techniques with the traditional liturgical and musical practices of the synodal school. The main aspect of Golovanov's unique compositional style is his use of harmony. I think you'll hear that in a bit. Kovalyov, a musicologist from Russia, states that Golovanov uses harmony as a dominant compositional principle where harmony governs form, expression, and development. Golovanov favors seventh chords, often using ninths and extensions up to the 13th, essentially just stacking thirds on top of each other and forming these rich, expansive harmonies, especially in his later compositions, resembling what modern listeners might associate with jazz. One recurring sonority is the major seventh chord in third and fourth inversions. As seen boxed in example 3, these sonorities often appear on strong beats and agogically stressed syllables, bringing prominence to this striking harmonic color. In inversion and enclosed position, the major seventh chord forms dense clusters that heighten tension before resolving, creating the lush harmonic undulation characteristic of Golovanov's style. The minor Phrygian plagal cadence, with an augmented sixth, is a particularly striking sonority I have not found examples of in other new Russian choral school compositions. Example 4, from the second movement of his sacred choral concerto, Радуйтеся Богу, помощнику нашему, which means rejoice in the Lord, our helper, shows a complex sonority in the second half of measure 10. This cadence is led by the soprano melody, terminating in a descending fourth to B, the dominant of E minor, on the downbeat of measure 11, a melodic device drawn from the Russian folk tradition, which appears frequently in Golovanov's music. Sopranos, can we sing bars 9 to 11? So that da-da, that descending fourth is idiomatic of a Russian folk melody. In example 5, you can see the folk melody Ach ty, step shirokaya, which means, O you, wide steppe. An example of the plach, a lament, and the pratyazhny, a drawn-out lyrical song, which are typically in a minor tonality, where the tonic pitch is preceded by the subdominant, da-dum, not only in cadences, but as a melodic trope throughout. Oftentimes, this descent by fourth is filled in by descending scalar tetrachord, so da-dee-da-dum. Another folk melody that you might know, da-da-dum, bum, dee-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-dee-da-bum, bum. There's that subdominant, dominant. Another familiar folk melody demonstrating this melodic motion, which gives Golovanov's music a distinctly Russian nationalistic quality. The striking sonority, back to example 4, takes place on the second half of beat 4, where the altos sink down to C natural before resolving down to a unison B with the sopranos. As Golovanov approaches the half cadence in E minor, the altos and sopranos sing notes in the B Phrygian scale, an ear-turning mode made distinct by its minor second half step. So, is what that sounds like. In addition, the tenors, A sharp on beat 3, forms an augmented sixth with the altos in the second half of beat 4. While the basses and tenors sustain a secondary dominant chord, the sopranos sing a scale altogether foreign to that harmony. Right? So I think it's F sharp major, but there's all these extra naturals in there that don't belong. So A natural in the soprano part clashes with the A sharp in the first tenor, while the C natural in the alto part clashes with the C sharp in the first basses. So this sonority is nice and special. It's a spicy sonority. I'd like the choir to perform for us now. Measures 6 to 11. From the second movement of the concerto. This sonority is found in several other minor key compositions, including Покаяние отверзи ми двери, opus 37, number 1, which you'll hear later. Example 6 shows this sonority functioning like a plagal cadence in the context of C sharp minor. The bass motion in measures 32 to 33 is from the subdominant to the tonic. The sopranos and altos sing a folk-like melody in unison from measure 29. They divide in measure 32, where the sopranos have the idiomatic descent by fourth, dum, bum, to the tonic at the fermata. In measure 32, the altos sing a C-sharp Phrygian scale with the first basses forming an augmented sixth against the alto's D natural on beat 4. Now let's have the choir demonstrate this sonority, but in a different piece. This is Покаяние отверзи двери, measures 29 to 33. These examples demonstrate how Golovanov uses harmony as a punctuation in form, indicating the arrival at a cadence. It's also used expressively. In the first example, set to the words «Sice желает душе моя к тебе, Боже», which means «So my soul longs for you, O God», it conveys an almost mournful longing. In the second example, this sonority set to the words «Твоею милостью», which means «Your mercy», takes on an air of weight and repentance. Other examples of Golovanov's unique style can be traced back to his work in secular operatic and symphonic music. The theatricalization of choral sound can be heard in the juxtaposition of choral groups, their call and response, and active interactions which evoke the massive choral scenes in the operas of Mussorgsky and Borodin. I read somewhere that Golovanov was obsessed with the music of Mussorgsky, especially his operas, so this makes sense. In example 7, in which Golovanov writes a playful call and response passage in the third movement of the Sacred Concerto, measure 25 to 38, where the sopranos and altos are echoed twice by the tenors and basses. The second time, the altos join with the tenors and basses before a fortissimo tutti arrival in bar 39. Let's hear the choir sing the third movement of the Sacred Choral Concerto, measures 25 to 42. Golovanov's dramatization of text can best be seen in the climax of his Otche Nash, measures 16 to 23 in example 8. Here, expressive priorities outweigh strict adherence to church practices as the semantic content of the text is rendered with emotional intensity and vivid imagery. Golovanov builds tension over a C-sharp dominant pedal starting in measure 19 on the words «No izbavi nas od lukavego, but deliver us from evil». Golovanov has a dramatic crescendo to triple forte, the tempo broadens to sostenuto molto, and the expressive indication is con disperazione, with desperation. This desperate plea for God's redemption is powerfully depicted by the strains of all voice parts at the top of their respective ranges, especially the sopranos and tenors. The tenors hit a high B natural, the highest note that he penned for the tenors in all of his sacred choral music. And you'll see that the music peaks at a triple forte, and on the last page of music of that, pictured in example 9, we go all the way down to triple piano. So the range of dynamics is triple F to triple piano. There's also a lot of divisi that you can see in both of these examples. The basses are worthy of note. You'll see that on the last page in example 9, the range of the basses is unprecedentedly low. In contrast, the lowest note Rachmaninoff wrote in his sacred choral music was a B-flat 1 in the closing bars of the fifth movement of his all-night vigil. Golovanov's demands for the basses are impressive, to say the least. Tonight you will hear a low G. Golovanov's expertise as a choral master can be gleaned from the remarks in his score. We'll talk briefly about performance practice before we sing a bit tonight. For instance, in example 11, you can see Golovanov's knowledge of the tessitura of each section of the choir. When in Slava Единоrodной Scenie, he asks the top voice of the tenor to double the lowest part of the alto in measures 29 to 34. There's a little asterisk there that the composer left a note. This serves not only to reinforce the melody, but to enrich the timbre of that line. In example 12, showing the first movement of the sacred concerto, Golovanov reinforces the tenor melody with the baritones when the melody dips below the staff, a tricky spot in the tenor's voice, in measure 34 and 36. He uses the same technique throughout the piece. These examples not only show how Golovanov demonstrates mastery of choral orchestration, but also his intimate knowledge of the human voice, the needs and capabilities of each voice part, and how they relate to the realization of his musical conception. There are also puzzling moments in Golovanov's music that suggest that he may have prioritized musical effect over practical considerations. If you look at example 13, for instance, you'll see that the lowest basses are forced to sing a high C-sharp 4 above the staff, and on the very next beat have to sing a low A over 3 octaves apart. So, I think it's unlikely that Golovanov skipped that class in synodal school. Tonight, the lowest basses will not sing measures 87 through 90 to prepare for the low tessitura in measures 91 through 92. I have a feeling Golovanov would have done the same, especially since his choirs were 100 strong. Lastly, example 14 shows Golovanov's piano reductions for rehearsal that can be illuminating artifacts for phrasing, articulation, and other questions of performance practice. Golovanov was particular about prescribing breaths for the choir, reinforcing the idea that Russian Orthodox music is often sung with staggered breaths, regardless of punctuation. Between measures 57 and 58 in example 14, there's a comma before the repeated text, "Spasi nas," save us. The choir is running out of breath by this point for sure, and will be tempted to breathe, but they should resist the urge knowing that Golovanov drew a slur in the piano reduction between the same bars. The music you will hear in a few minutes will be presented in chronological order of composition. This lecture also aligns with my capstone project, for which I created new accessible editions of the music you'll hear tonight, with English transliterations of the Church Slavonic text, so translating the hieroglyphs into something that we as English speakers can actually make sense of. This past Sunday, we recorded the same music, which will be published soon, so please stay tuned. In conclusion, these observations reveal Golovanov as a composer who both inherited and expanded the traditions of the new Russian choral school. His works synthesized chant-derived materials with bold harmonic choices, extreme vocal ranges, and an effective use of choral orchestration that pushed beyond the conventions of his contemporaries. The combination of lush textures, dramatic expression, dynamic intensity, and a uniquely personal harmonic language underscores why his sacred music warrants renewed attention and performance today. Before we sing for you, and I'll have this wonderful chamber choir come up, I'd like to make a few acknowledgments. First of all, thank you so much to my parents and my family. I'm so happy you could fly in and you could be here today to witness this. My rock, my foundation, and a support system I could not live without. My professors, Dr. Scott, who was instrumental in the conception, the drafting, and the revision of this lecture. Dr. Miller, whom I have admired since I was your student at Westminster Choir College, and I'm so grateful for our time together. I'm also grateful for him serving as my capstone project advisor. And Dr. Siegel, your Russian music class that I took last year formed a solid foundation for this lecture. Thank you for your guidance as my lecture evolved into its present form. I'm forever grateful to the members of this choir. I'm so lucky to work with this group of gifted musicians, not least among them basses, who are able to realize Golovanov's really demanding music with accuracy and heartfelt intention. My cohort of conductors, you've all influenced me in meaningful ways. Your passion for our shared craft, the unique expertise you bring with you, and the much-needed moments of humor and banter that we share, they lighten and vary our days and have shaped me into who I am today. I'm especially grateful to my trailblazing colleagues in this degree program, my classmate Rachel Feldman, Trevor Krager, who was a skilled producer at Saturday's recording session, Kristen Sears, Landon Scriber, and Matthew Swope, who all completed this requirement. So here we go. Thank you especially to Father Tim Fahey and Liette McManaman for their generous support of this project and for opening the doors of Annunciation so that we can all gather to hear this rarely performed music in this incredible space. And thank you all for being here tonight. Enjoy the performance.